Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 800. In the Spamcast 800, Johanna Rothman takes over the podcast and interviews Jeremy Willets and me. We discuss mastering work intake, why principles make more sense than best practices, and how disciplined work intake is the core to getting work done. We learn that in practice, stop starting and start finishing only works when you pay attention to the work that goes into a system. Before we dive into the conversation, I was asked the best way to spread the word about mastering work intake. The single best way is to leave a review on Amazon, Goodreads, or wherever you buy your books. Reviews increase the likelihood that somebody like you will discover the book. Are you ready to talk work intake? It's time for the conversation.
I had the pleasure of reading Mastering Work Intake. The subtitle is really important. From Chaos to Predictable Delivery. I have been a listener to Tom's podcast for years and years and years. I have had the pleasure of meeting Jeremy on the podcast and at some point in person in our previous lives at conferences. And so when Tom and Jeremy wrote this book, I said, I want to read it because this is a huge, huge problem for all of the people I know, all of my clients, all the people who think they might be clients. It's really, this business of work intake is a really big problem. So that's why I have a little takeover of Tom's podcast for this session to really go into a little bit of depth about why this book and the value that people will get out of this book. So let's start in. I really liked one of the earlier statements where you said it's the largest determinant of whether an organization or team can get work done. So that's a really bold statement, this business about mastering work intake. Tell us more. Tell the listeners more about that.
Well, let's just start with the premise, right? So if a team or even an organization just says yes to everything, stuff comes in willy-nilly, whether it comes in from the side, wherever it comes from. If it's coming in unqualified, people start on it, they never really have a chance to master it and get it done. They might get parts of it done. They might get it done with high levels of technical debt. All sorts of things can happen. But in the end, the value they deliver is far less than they should.
The word done is definitely the word that I latched onto in that quote as you were reading, Johanna. I know it's sort of antithetical to the title of the book since we're talking about the start of work. But the ability to get things done is such a differentiator for firms and companies. I'm sure that all three of us have seen instances of a lot of firms that start a lot of work, but they never actually get things all the way through to done where they get, they can start to reap rewards of revenue, recurring revenue, et cetera, et cetera. It's so many firms start things, and starting things feels good, but so does finishing things.
It's organizational ADD.
It might be a part of that. I once worked with a client who had all initiatives. They had, it was a small company. They must have had 45 initiatives and they could not point. The reason they asked me to come in was to do an assessment of why things were so slow. This is in the early O's. Or maybe the middle O's, where I had not yet published the project portfolio book, and they just could not figure out how to get anything through the organization. So, and they were trying to bootstrap. There was a whole bunch of stuff going on, and when I said to them, "You have to start saying no to some things. You must not say yes to everything." I know. They looked at me as if I had said, Klingon instead of English, right? I mean, they just could not believe it. So that business of done really hooked me at the start of this book.
Well, and here's the problem. It hasn't gotten any better. I've been at this a while also and can point to any number of exactly the same kind of scenarios, whether it's before the O's, in the O's, or even a couple of weeks ago. It's not, it really hasn't gotten any better. It is far easier to start things than it is to get them done. And it's, it's, at some level, it's easy to say to somebody, hey, we'll put it on the backlog, or we'll start it, and perhaps they'll forget.
As you were telling that story, Johanna, I was thinking to myself, how do those people handle their personal lives? Are they unable to say no in their personal lives? Is that, I think one of the patterns I've certainly seen is that people feel relatively comfortable saying no to things in their personal lives, whether it's, do you want to go grab a beer with me after work? Do you want to go, on vacation with me? Do you want to go spend time doing this other activity? But when it comes to work, for whatever reason, we are predicated to just default to yes and have yes be the default answer for everything.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. Even I, who love chocolate and totally admit to loving chocolate, can say no to too much chocolate. I mean, there is such a thing as too much. So, we all most of us manage our weight, we manage our exercise, we manage our intake of water, we manage all these things. And I find it very interesting that there's this, if I could call it even that, people-pleasing idea at work, that there's something through the hierarchy and through the project and the backlog and all this nonsense that we really have trouble saying no.
So, it's obvious that we have trouble. It's obvious that it is trouble. What would you attribute the fact that we can't manage that?
Well, I think you should talk about your core principles now, because that leads directly into them. But I think that there's a bunch of stuff on the personal level where many of us, not named Johanna, have a very difficult time saying no up the hierarchy, right? One of the reasons I was such a successful project manager and then a program manager and then a manager is because I had no fear of saying no to anybody above me. And I think that a lot of people, now, I also say in some of my books, I often called my husband during the day and said, I might not be employed by the end of the day. Right? I mean, this business of saying no has such fear because we are so, and especially in the US, we are so tied to our employers for our health insurance and our ability to save for retirement. There's this very bad knot. It's really a Gordian knot of companies who, how can I say this in a way that does not blame companies for what the U.S. Taxes and reporting does, right? There's a whole system that makes companies not very bright when it comes to managing work intake and to managing people. How about if I just say that?
That's good.
And I'll stop there because I really want to go on to a different question. For those of you who are listening, I have a whole series of questions that I want to ask Tom and Jeremy. You actually said, and I'm quoting, intake refers to both how the work is acquired and the amount of work taken into the team or the organization. And I really love that because it talks really about who asks for the work and the general idea of WIP. So if you can talk more about that, the work acquisition and the work taken.
Sure, I'll start with that one. Who asks for the work is such a huge thing. I think that a lot of us want to do work for customers. We want to do work that is going to be directly utilized. But I think what Tom and I have seen, and I'm sure you've seen this too, is that a lot of the work that gets done is on the pet project front, or on the, CEO comes up to somebody's desk and has a thing to do that they think will be useful, whether or not it's tied to a direct customer or to some sort of, useful use case. And so a lot of the work that we get done, I think, actually is not value add work. And so who asks for that work is so imperative to the work we do.
It's a combination of things, right? So it's who asks, and the way we go through, and to use sort of a medical term, we triage it. Because very frankly, the tap on the shoulder could actually be high value work. But
True.
But if it jumps the process, if it jumps the triage where somebody actually sits down and thinks about it, whether it's a formal process or a relatively informal process, you still have to think through such that you can then qualify what gets actually started. I did a job several years ago for a group where some of the product, and we ended up with a product owner council, which was its own sort of interesting approach to that triage. But for one of the teams, 3 of the product owners were Nobel Prize winners. And I'm not going to suggest that they have the largest egos in the world, but
they might.
But the interesting thing was when they got together with, especially since some of the other product owners on that council weren't Nobel Prize winners, when they all got together and worked together to prioritize the list of work for, unfortunately, one team. They actually thought through the process. Before they did that, it was, well, hey, I actually heard in the hall somebody turn around and say, you have to remember that I am a winner of a Nobel Prize. You will do what I tell you to do. And I actually heard that. Interestingly enough, side story there. The person, my eldest daughter, once upon a time actually did some work for this person. Very nice human being. And she actually killed all his tadpoles in an experiment. Oh. She got to spend 2 weeks up in New Hampshire, walking through water, fishing out new tadpoles for him. But
Did you disclose this story before working with the client? Or
heck
like
no.
a learning after the fact?
Heck no. And it was fine. Nobody ever remembered that story. Probably happened to other people. But again, people are reasonable. Even people with the most enormous, if they understand the rules and can engage to the level where they can commit to playing the game.
Yeah. And setting those rules, I think the part of what you have discussed in this book is a way to figure out what should be the rules for us, for what work we accept, and then finish. And I do need to talk about starting energy and finishing energy. And I, at some point, want to talk to you guys about how you wrote the book, because I love to start books. I love to start them. I hate finishing that business. I have checklists for myself because I get it to most of the way done, and I'm already done with the interesting parts of it. I have already learned what I wanted to say. I have already done all that good stuff. And that last little bit, that getting it from 95% to 100%, or worse, 98% to 100%, I hate that. I reward myself with a little bit of wine at dinner and chocolate. So yeah, you can tell what kind of a person I am by my rewarding myself. But this business of the principles and the starting and the finishing, I think you guys have a lot to say there. So maybe you can talk about that next.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sure. I think I forget, I think, Tom, you probably wrote up the initial draft of this 9 core principles concept for your blog way back when. It was one of the sort of seeds to this whole work intake conversation. And as we wrote the book and as we kept sort of coming back to what we thought the main points of the book were, we kind of kept coming back to this whole 9 core principles concept. And we've used this. We talked about it in our workshop last week. We've talked about it in sort of like quasi marketing videos. But, when you take those 9 core principles and you think about the processes that we all follow for this whole work intake concept, they seem really strong. I know that in the book, we deconstruct the Scrum example of work intake, and we put that through the paces in terms of the 9 core principles. And even Scrum, which is a framework that I think all 3 of us have used, and probably many of the listeners have used or at least been exposed to throughout their career, it doesn't really have an answer for some of these 9 principles. And I thought that was refreshing to look at it and kind of go, even Scrum, which is held up as one of the totems for 21st century knowledge work, isn't all there when it comes to this whole work intake challenge.
Yeah, how do you deal with things like accountability and consequences? If somebody decides not to play, no point in the small number of pages that's the Scrum guide does it say that you take them out back and have a conversation kind of thing. It's not there. It's not. Obviously, there are things like transparency that get mentioned, but I don't know that they get operationalized. There's a lot of hand waving, whether it's Scrum or any of the others. It's like, well, get a backlog, and you wave your hands in the air, and suddenly you have a backlog, and you start to break it down. The problem is that people slap it in a tool at that point, and it suddenly is hidden from sight. Nobody knows what's going on. We lose that transparency so that you can't have a discussion about the feature that, we threw on the backlog, 3 weeks ago and is now 97th, and we're working through some sort of flow, and we're getting a feature done once a quarter. And the one that's 97 is probably sometime early next century, especially with other things floating in. I almost think that's unethical, right? So things like transparency. And then what happens if somebody, slips one in and it goes around, and suddenly, you have people that said, well, hey, you said you were going to work on mine, and it's still really high priority, best thing since sliced bread, but you're not doing it. There has to be consequences to that kind of an activity.
So can you talk a little bit about ownership and responsibility? Because that's the 9th of your 9 principles. And I think that there are many people who call themselves product owners who do not have control of the product strategy. They are not product managers. They are way too often order takers. And every time I see a business analyst whose skills are great for actually understanding what they do, the translation from business speak to tech speak, they might even interview customers. They are, for lack of a better term, down and dirty into the product. They understand enough about the product architecture. They understand about the team. They understand how to make the work in the product. They don't have all the other higher level skills to move up the organization and up the hierarchy. And therefore, they feel totally unresponsible, if that's even a word. They don't know how to take that responsibility and manage the work intake. What do you suggest for people with that title, but that lack of ability for all the other reasons that have nothing to do with their ability to do their real job?
Well, they're not responsible, and they can't. You can't make somebody responsible for something that if they act responsible, it will be the end of their career, right? So, and that's exactly what will happen. By the way, the new version of that, I mean, obviously those sort of proxy product owners don't work, but a new one that I've seen come back, almost like a boomerang, is taking team leads and making them product owners, which is just as crazy. Jeremy, you were about to say?
Yeah, I think the concept of ownership is a really interesting one, and we built in activities throughout the book that I'm sure you saw as you were going through, Johanna. And one of the ones at the end of section 2 really pokes at this responsibility thing and ownership thing, because it's really going to vary depending on the organization, depending on the company you're working with. And I think a real fundamental challenge in this whole work intake equation is to actually figure out who's responsible for what and who owns it. And that's why we've tried to design the activities in this book as sort of like a map kind of thing. So you can sort of build up your awareness of the current state before you talk about the future state. And hopefully through that activity, people will be able to get a better understanding of who's actually got those responsibilities, because they're really, it can be interwoven, misunderstood, conflated, any sort of quasi bad word you can think of.
Somebody does have that responsibility, or at least is actually doing it, whether or not on paper they are, they have ownership or not. Somebody's actually playing that role. You have to know who they are. You have to then start deciding as an organization how you're going to modify your culture. And we might get into this, large, sort of religious argument about you can't change culture. Well, arguably, culture is highly tied to behavior, and we can change behavior if we choose to change behavior. And you have to start having that honest, transparent conversation about who's doing it. And just calling, a BA or a team lead or, Larry the janitor, the product owner, right? And just calling them that doesn't mean they're playing that role. Doesn't mean they have that ownership. It may well be a manager over here. It may well be somebody it may be somebody in the business that doesn't have that title and doesn't want it and doesn't want to be seen. They might want to be pulling those strings behind the curtains. But until you know that, you can't have that conversation.
I would like to talk a little bit more about transparency, because I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't irritate too many people. Many of my clients, and I suspect many of yours, use a very common tool, and they make tickets for their features. Now, I refuse to let my clients use the term epic or theme, because several years ago, I taught a product ownership class, and there were two teams from two very large teams, 20 plus people. And one team had been acquired by original company acquires secondary company. They were using two different tools. One said, feature is a part of a story. Okay. I'm not sure why there was a difference between feature as a part of a story. And then once we got to story level, the next level up for original team was epic. And then on top of that, theme. And on the acquired company, it was theme and then epic. Right. So theme and epic were the reverse of what they had in each company. So I said, we are not going to talk about themes or epics. We are going to talk about feature sets. Because if you want several features in a coherent pattern, right, that solve a problem for a customer, we're going to talk about feature sets. And we're not going to use those tools in this class. It's not going to happen. And what I find in my clients now is that even if they use the same tool, they are not talking about how to aggregate the stories up into a feature set, which means there's random stuff all over the place and there's no transparency because something got put into the tool somewhere and you can only look at it. It's almost as bad as an Excel spreadsheet, right? And in a spreadsheet, you can see the first 5 letters of anything in a cell. But you cannot see the bigger picture unless you make the spreadsheet show you the bigger picture. And what I see way too often, this is why I'm headed back to transparency, is that we don't have transparency on those feature sets. We don't have transparency even at the story level or feature level because we don't see all of the implications for it. The tool actually hides the work in ways that the stickies or the cards on the corkboard did not.
I 100% agree. And I don't, it's not any single individual tool that you can lay this at the door of. Having worked with at least a half dozen of them, including the 2 most currently popular, they all have the same problem. And they're all probably of the same ilk. The reality is things like mapping, story mapping, things like feature sets are not well discussed. And therefore, it is a problem of transparency. Therefore, it's easy to add things in. Al Shalloway actually made that when he started to have his large problem with weighted shortest job first, at least the way SAFE does it. That was one of his original problems with it, is that too much was being sort of lumped into these things that were not high value and therefore were riding along. Arguably, you might even have a different problem later on as things sort of agglomerate to it, sort of the black hole theory, right? Things sort of, swim in. But I don't think it's people trying to act wrong. I think the reason that we're spread out, that we've gone to a scenario where we want to do really large things, makes it easy for the tools and then the processes around the tools, which are not systematized. I mean, when you were talking about the different levels of one to the other, I can probably guess which tool that they were using because they all use different words for all these things. It makes it very hard, even if we wanted to be transparent, the lack of a consistent vocabulary, a lack of a conversation periodically and more than once every 90 days about this makes it really hard to be transparent because, hey, even if, let's say you're doing it every 90 days, which in some companies that would be just wonderful because they're only doing it once a year. During December and early January when nobody's paying attention to anything. But let's say you're doing it that. I mean, you have, even if it's a couple of days, you have to cram stuff in and you talk as fast as you humanly can. And you flash up a whole bunch of graphs and screens and things, and then you run like heck and do what you're going to do.
I think for many places, just getting the work to be in a common tool is a pretty big step. And a lot of places view that as enough. They view it as we've got everything in a tool. There's our information radiation, right? Whereas, I'll I'll borrow a phrase from Tom and my old boss. He used to talk about information being in electronic tools as information refrigeration. And I think that there's a degree of truth to that. And you both hit on that. Tom, you mentioned the word conversation. Johanna, you mentioned the word aggregation. That it's like step one is get the stuff in the tool, but step 2 through like N is talk about it. Bring people into the conversation. Continue the conversation. Don't just do it at a quarterly planning kind of thing where you have the attention of 300 people. There's a lot of work to be done to correlate those different individual bits with customer value, with direct facing customer value in the products that we're building. So, and that's hard to do. That usually requires like people to do that too. It can't just be an AI to do that. It can't just be some sort of automated process that does that. You need to have a person doing that. And I speak about that because I've lived this reality for the last 5 years or so at my current employer. We were the classic example of, well, we've got everything in our tool. That's enough, right? And the answer was no. The answer was definitely no. We needed multiple people across different disciplines to help stitch those things together so that we could have cohesive product delivery strategies across long-term timeframes.
Let me push on that a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you said that long-term time frame, because not every product can be delivered to its customers on a regular basis, like every day or every week. And you might have to, especially if you have a hardware product, and then, or hardware. Yeah, you do. And so the cost of releasing is very, very high. You might be able to release the software layer or the firmware layer, but releasing a hardware regularly, that does not make sense. So, and I think that we all need to figure out, how do we have the short term, what are we going to do now, and deliver it internally so people can see it, versus what do we plan for later, and what eventually do we deliver to our customers. And what I really like about the core principles is you can use them at every level, right? At the team level for the backlog, at the product level for the product strategy, at the portfolio level for the project portfolio, for any size product. I find that, well, you guys know me. I really love principles over practices, right? Mm-hmm. And you have all these principles in this book that make it possible for people to be actually able to master work intake.
It boils down to context, right? So if we had hard techniques and there are some in there, obviously, and there's some approaches to actually, the exercises to finding out who and what is the flow and where are the power centers, those sorts of things. Those are important, but if we had a map or a set of God help me, best practices that you should absolutely follow, that might work for one context. The ideas of the principles, right, allow you to walk through and say, how are we solving for this? And based on the context of our organization, the way we think, the way we act, the product, or even the projects that we're doing, what are they? And how do we then accommodate these things? Because you have to, especially the 9, you have to deal with them at some level across the board. But depending on if you're doing portfolio at the highest level of the organization, those 9 are going to be different. The level of transparency is going to be different because, very frankly, if I did bank mergers for a long time, and very frankly, if any of that information, leaked, we'd all go to jail. And by the way, I think that would be bad. But at the very least, there'd be a lot of people, running off doing insider trading, and then that would be bad. So, context is important, but within the bubble, you had to know the people that were making decision. You had to have that transparency.
And principles are a nice way of sort of instantiating these new thoughts in places. I think whether it's the 9 core principles that we've talked about here, or even the stuff from the manifesto, because I'm sure you've both dealt with this. People have a gut reaction when they see a framework, whether it's Scrum, whether it's SAFe, whether it's something else. Their initial reaction is usually, "That's great, but it won't work for us. ... And here's why." And they'll explain here's why. But if you talk to them about principles and you say, you know what, we want to prioritize our work. We want to have some control over how work gets to our team. We want it to be transparent. We want it to be consistent. We want some level of frequency. It's like, how are you going to craft an argument around those words exactly?
I don't want to be
seems much harder to go after. And then if you have that and then if you hear that reaction, then you can use those coachy questions to sort of uncover why you don't. Well, why, Tom? Why don't you want it to be transparent? Oh, you're working with bank mergers. Okay, fine. I understand that. You don't want to go to prison. We don't want you to go to prison either, Tom.
Thank you.
Yeah, we do not. We really do not. So I want to go a little bit meta now and talk to you guys about writing this book. Because if you are anything like me, as you write the book, you realize, I could put this thing in, but does it belong in this book? This is a form of mastering work intake for a very specific, much smaller product, right? A book. I have the ebook, so I don't know how many pages it is, but and for those of you who are listening, the ebook is very easy to read. So you should buy the book and read it. But it's not more than a couple hundred pages, is it?
270, I think, is the number. I just flipped it.
Oh, okay.
All right. And that includes index, front matter, blank pages, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So it's not ridiculously long. It's very easy to read and it flows. So, and I'm sure you had to re-architect the book as I always do for my books when I realized, oh, this does not fit right here. But let me ask you about mastering work intake for your book and how you decided to pair write this book.
Sure. I mean, it started with pandemic happy hour calls. Tom and I had sort of lost contact. We worked together for a few years, and then I went one way and Tom went another way. And I continued to listen to his podcast, but in terms of like interaction, hadn't had a whole lot of interaction. But the pandemic started. We started to have these happy hour calls with former colleagues. We got to talking. Tom broached the idea of this book. At some point, we wanted to talk about work entry and it being a forceful thing versus intake, which seems softer. So at one point, we were talking about that. At some point, Tom, I think we kicked around some sort of stew metaphor and using some sort of stew metaphor as the entirety of our book. And we tried to architect text around that. I remember talking vividly about the stew that my mom used to make when we were kids and about how we could have different ingredients in the work intake stew. And, that seemed helpful for a little while, but I think that we latched on.
By the way, is still in the folder called The Cutting Room Floor.
So we can go back to the stew metaphor at some point, maybe for book 2.
But we did, right? We went through that process of working through, dragging things in, dragging things out. By the way, we did reorg the book. You and I had a conversation. I don't know what it was about, but we had an email conversation about ordering of a book and why that was important. And that had a change of order in the book right after that, based on that conversation. So that was the influence to flow. But we individually, we worked through and, one document, plopped in sections, started working on it. I would follow through Jeremy's section and change, the wording a little bit here and there. Jeremy has a style of writing and my style of writing aren't exactly the same. And we've gone through a number of smoothings where it became more Jeremy, more Tom, more Jeremy, and then sort of Tom-a-me or something like that at the end. But But it did. Your earlier statement about getting to done. This took, I think we originally thought it would take us about a year. I think it took us about 2 years. And part of that was, there was a chunk in the middle of the second year where we slowed down. It may have been just the summer or something like that. But it was, we knew what done had, by then we had come up with a structure. We had come up with what we wanted to put in there. We cut those things that we didn't anymore want out, and they're sitting in the cutting room floor folder. And we worked to basically a set of acceptance criteria that we came up for ourselves. And that helped us, whether it's a checklist or whatever, it helped us to actually progress against us. We also held each other accountable. So we used an accountability pair to actually make this work.
And I do think there were two pretty pivotal events last year, like right around this time last year, that really helped us get that done mojo energy that you were talking about earlier, Johanna. The first one was speaking at the Detroit conference, Agile and Beyond. So we went there and we hadn't finished the book yet, but we had enough done that we felt like we put together a coherent workshop. We delivered the content. We got excellent feedback from the people that were there. So that was a real kick in the pants to go finish off the book, as well as Tom reaching out to his publishing colleagues. So he reached out to the firm that had published his last book and, pitched the idea of the book. They were incredibly interested in it. They were going to take up and handle sort of all the logistical pieces that we didn't know how to handle. Not that we didn't have the energy to handle them. We just didn't know how to handle them. And, getting their blessing and perspective and understanding that they thought it was a valid topic to go publish was really helpful too.
After it got rejected 3 or 4 times by others.
That's a different conversation. We can talk about book publishing when I write my triad of how to write, publish, and market your nonfiction book. Yeah, that's for next year. So yeah. So let me show you what you did in your principles for finishing this book. You prioritized the work you wanted to do and did not want to do. And you changed that periodically because that's why the cutting room floor exists. Mm-hmm. We need to do the same thing in our products. You got some early feedback with the workshop. You probably got some early feedback with other people that you have not talked about, but that's fine. And that changed your control and your prioritization of what you wanted to put in here. You were transparent with each other about where you were on the book all the time. I am sure that you were consistent in how you made these decisions. You frequently addressed, does this belong here? And even if you wrote for a while and then said, oh, maybe this is not in this book, and there's value in the cutting room floor. You made those decisions frequently, and you were prepared for those decisions, right? You always had all the information you needed. You had respect for each other and for the product. You had, and I think having respect for the product allowed you to figure out when do we need feedback from others? When do we need which kind of feedback so we can make more decisions, right? This is actually a very big deal. I suspect you had consequences for each other about jumping the queue for what to write when. And while you were both jointly responsible for ownership, I suspect you had many levels of ownership responsibilities.
Yeah, I do remember being told off once when I was decided to work on the metrics piece before some of the other pieces that we had, committed to each other. So it's like, and I do remember that. And we got done. We did a weekly call. We got done with that weekly call. I went in the other room. I swore at my dog. And then I put the stuff I was working on down and got back to work on the things that I was supposed to be doing. It was an the idea of accountability, whether that's at the top of the organization or, just writing, working on a project to write a book together. It really made it possible to get to done. And then to take the next step and start to work on workshops and, those sorts of things. Had we not, we would be wandering all over. We'd be working on the workshop when we hadn't finished the book. And it really was a microcosm. I think you're absolutely right of why you have to control what comes in, therefore, so you can get done. I mean, we've all heard that wonderful adage, right? Stop starting and start finishing. Well, the reality is that's true. But it's true only if you pay attention to what goes in so that you get the right stuff out.
Yeah, and Tom keyed in on this in his example of using profanity with his dog a minute ago. But we're the guys who wrote the book on work intake, and we even fell victim to some of this stuff. I mean, there were times that I probably, swore at my iPad after getting done with the call with Tom because I wanted to go work on this new interesting thing. Like we stood up this whole, the most recent tantalizing thing that we've been working on is this whole concept of a workshop. And I know, Johanna, you do workshops for people. It's our time to go really make this material breathe and shine and, reap some financial benefit from that as well. But there was a time where I didn't want anything to do with writing any more of the book. I wanted to go pursue this cohort thing, but we still had work to do on that front. And so Tom kept me honest and accountable there too.
Well, and depending on the kind of product you have, sometimes it's useful to have the workshop before you finish the book. That informs, that gives you data that informs the book. I find that if I wait on the entire book to do the entire workshop, I might never get this book done. So yeah.
We did the conference stuff that we did, the workshops at the conference did happen prior to the book, and we did incorporate in that feedback. The bigger, more formal one, was after the book. But it was based on all that stuff. And even if it ends up on the cutting room floor, neither one of us have a problem with picking it up, dusting it off, and going, was this idea, maybe we should, layer in the stew thing again.
Yeah. And Tom, I will say, Tom is very disciplined with his content generation. I mean, you don't put out almost 800 episodes of a podcast by accident. There's a lot of discipline there. I tell people that I did a lot of my writing for this book while I was waiting for, swimming lessons to finish up or ballet lessons to finish up for one of my kids. But, Tom is hard to keep pace with. And so that was really helpful. You talk about accountability and responsibility. That was incredibly helpful to be doing this on someone who was making me, try and catch up and making me try and keep pace. That was excellent. It really was. I think this book would not have happened if it was a solo effort for sure, or, with other authors. It just wouldn't have happened for me, at least.
That's why you're so amazing. I mean, other than the Calgey book, most of yours are solo shots, and I don't know if I could point out a half a dozen of them over here on my bookshelf and then over here on my Kindle. So, as I said, we reordered our book after my conversation with you on structure and ideas about structure and how they had to flow. And it's I think that was in a prep for a podcast that you and I had done on one of your books. And it's maybe we didn't think that through quite as well as we should. We all learn from each other.
Yeah, I find that the more I talk and work with other people, the smarter I get.
I can't argue with that. Well,
Agreed.
most people.
It's funny that your mind went immediately to the people that you don't get smarter from.
Yeah, it was a long weekend.
All right. So I think it's sort of time for us to wrap up. And I have two more questions. So if you can think of one or two things from the book that you want people to take away, what are each of you? Maybe just limit yourself to one thing. So each of you, limit yourself to one thing. What do you want people to take away from this book? What is the most important thing from your perspective? And Tom, I will go with you first.
All right. The most important thing is that work intake is absolutely dead critical to actually being agile or being anything, to getting work done, and that you can change your behavior. You have to plan it out. You have to think about it. You have to understand what's really happening today, but it is a solvable problem.
The thing I want people to take away from this is the learning they get from the activities in the book. It's all of what Tom described is distilled hopefully into those 4 end of section activities, so that when people are done with this book, whether they're reading the electronic version or the paper version, they will have tangible things that they can go after to make this better.
Okay. And now, Tom, I'm going to ask if you woke up tomorrow morning with the beverage of your choice and you had a magic wand, and is it 2 wishes?
Yeah.
I never remember quite how you say that, but what are your wishes for this? And I will start with you first.
I want this to be important to people. I don't want it to be hand waving. And I think that would be the first thing that I would, tap my magic wand. Then, very frankly, I want people to actually talk about the work they're doing, whether it's at the organizational level and as it cascades down to the team level. They need to talk about this, and it can't be just suck it up and get it done.
Okay. And Jeremy?
Tom's wishes are very good wishes. I guess I would wish something similar, but I'll come up with 2 different ones just for the sake of argument. I think I would love it if people's default response was no longer yes to things in the workplace. I think I would love it if people gave more thought to a request than just an initial yes. So that's one. I think the other one would be an acknowledgement that the frameworks we have in front of us and the frameworks that we use don't have an answer for this. And that a lot of the answer, quote unquote, is figuring out what works for your context and your culture and your organization.
That's great. And I will end our conversation here. Thank you for allowing me to take over your podcast, Tom. This is great.
Thank you, Johanna. This was absolutely marvelous. Anytime that you want.
And Jeremy, it's so nice to see you in real time.
It was great to see you too.
Just hear you and all that stuff.
A quick advertisement. Jeremy Willets and I have opened up a new workshop cohort to help you learn to tame the work intake beast. The workshop runs from May 31st to June 28th in 5 manageable 1-hour chunks. For more details, go to our Maven site, link in the show notes for more information, and sign up. If you're just going to go to Maven, search for work intake and you'll find it. Even if you don't sign up, join the mailing list. Perhaps you'll want to do it or want to point somebody to it in the future. In Reread Saturday News, Chapter 1, Deep Work is Valuable, begins the first part of the book Deep Work, Rules for Focused Success in a Distracted World by Cal Newport. Part 1, The Idea, comprises the book's first 4 chapters and focuses on making the case for deep work. One of the interesting arguments for the value of deep work is that we are in the throes of digital transformation. Combining that trend with position internationalization and incrementalism yields all or nothing jobs. Read the chapter, our reread post, and contemplate. Links in the show notes to buy a copy of the book and to all previous installments of our reread of Deep Work. In the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 801, we will examine the question, at what level does not having clear priorities create a winning strategy? While the answer might seem self-evident, I'm not sure people and organizations put their money where their mouth is. We'll also have a visit from Case Kostecki, who brings her You Are Not Alone column to the podcast. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?